Okay, good. Well, today I'm going to talk about desktop accessibility, as you see, and a thing called UI automation, which probably none of you have ever heard of. I'm also going to try and impress you with the OpenOffice transition. I hope you enjoyed that one. Excellent. So you may have noticed or not that we recently announced another collaboration with Microsoft. Actually, it was tacked on right to the end of a press release, which no one read. So maybe you didn't notice. But anyway, turns out Microsoft is, we're collaborating with them to provide UIA, which is UI automation, I guess is what it stands for, which is a Microsoft API on Linux. And this is what various people say about it. This one is well worth listening to. Yumi is a lovely lady, and she's been involved in Linux accessibility for a long time. When we announced it was a bit sad because we knew they were setting up this industry association as well and would make it even better than it was. But basically the punchline is that Microsoft is disclaiming all of their patent rights on UIA. That's at least the business rationale, and putting it all under the OSP. Better than that, they're setting up this body, which has several working groups in it. These working groups, and all of the output of these working groups is also going to be covered by effectively a covenant not to sue. So we can work to merge the Linux infrastructure with Microsoft's and take the best bits of either of them, standardize it all in here, and bingo, we're done. So there's lots of companies involved, Adobe, these other people, Oracle, but yeah, I guess Microsoft is leading it at some level with Adobe and an AT vendor. There are loads and loads of AT vendors. AT is assistive technology, for those who don't know. People who make braille displays, people who make software like screen readers and so on to make computers accessible. But basically we want to drive convergence. You know, it's a relatively small space with relatively little investment in it, such that it's possible to know almost everyone who's everyone in accessibility and get them in a room and not have many more people in this. So, you know, it makes no sense to have multiple competing APIs and, you know, having to choose which one to implement, and, you know, the net result is clearly, you know, worse accessibility and wasting actually relatively limited resource pool unnecessarily. So it's a good thing. So I'm going to try and talk you through, briefly, the various different designs in this space for doing accessibility and how they're different. So this is the existing Linux accessibility stack. And you'll notice at the bottom of it we've got a whole load of Corba IPC interfaces, and these are defined, and you know, it was thought that it would be a good idea to standardize the IPC. I think that's actually a terrible idea, but at least, you know, there is a language agnostic IDL language you can do that in, and it looks like a good idea to start with. So, you know, well, whatever, you've got to work with something. I think it's better to standardize at this level, the 80K level, and get, you know, interfaces that can be wrapped there, and then hide the IPC, so you can optimize it, cache it, and rework it later. You see, virtually everyone is using 80K, unless they're using Python to go directly through Google. It turns out that there's some really beautiful Python bindings that just make it very easy to write screen readers natively in Python. And of course, the Java people go directly, they've got their own org, so I guess it's kind of, you know, attractive for them to bind that natively. And so you've got Java accessibility. This is the news story. Of course, before Fell, I guess, invested in moving this here, OpenOffice used to sit on top of the Java stack that used to map between OpenOffice accessibility and 80K, which made it horribly slow and yeah, really disastrous. So anyway, that's where we are at the moment, and it works pretty well. I'm not going to do any demos, just so you know. But you know, the punchline is that you can use your screen reader and you can introspect your widgets, and virtually everything is accessible. There are increasingly few things that you can't do, which is good news if you're okay. So hopefully the other thing you notice about the stack is relatively simple. There's a nice bus topology at the bottom, and you know, things talk to each other fairly normally. This is the UIA overview documentation of the simplified architecture that they have. And clearly Microsoft have got a long legacy tail of compatibility, and they have to work hard to make sure that they don't break stuff and so on. But here's basically how it works. The process boundary is much less well defined in the Microsoft world, simply because the IPC here is really not very good. It doesn't perform well. The interfaces are not very, you know, not suitably granular for doing lots of IPC. And so consequently, broadly, I'm trying to see, broadly application writers and AT writers, who are maybe on this side, yeah, they tend to shove a whole lot into the application itself. I forget. I can't understand the picture myself. Either way, they take their code and they go and shove it and export it into other applications where it can run quickly and it can use the native comm interfaces. And then they can control the IPC themselves, going to their screen reader, say. And so that's nice. And of course, they can add all sorts of other components into the process. So say if it's Microsoft Office, they can add things that understand the DOM, and they can get all sorts of other different bits of information they can grope around inside the application. They can even use programming APIs that are exposed by various applications, say Excel or something, to get even more information, and then crunch this all together, shove it over an IPC, a main pipe or whatever, and talk to their screen reader. And that's broadly how it works today. UIA, of course, aims to throw away much of this stuff and give a nicely clean API. So, hiding behind this picture here, how to proc MSAA clients, okay, that's the screen reader. Aha, how to proc UIA clients. So this is where you should be, basically. So you then have a very nice API that is UIA based, that is maybe much less granular. So you can do, sort of more advanced constructs and reduce the IPC round trip load. So you can start to do a lot of this stuff without needing all those horrible hacks in the same process. And so in theory, it's nice. It's a beautiful architecture. I really like it. And interesting, you'll notice that this guy here doesn't really need to know about all of this mess here. That's the other thing. So from an API perspective, they get quite a nice clean API here, and it's all the evilness is hidden from you, including all sorts of bridges that convert the old API to the new API in various pieces here, and so on and so on. So in theory, the new API is really a huge step forward. In practice, of course, if you'd invested millions of man-hours in making this old thing work, and all of your business value was in defeating the demons of complexity that were there before, you can understand that someone else doing that for you might not be perceived as threatening. So anyway, that's just an insight that might be helpful. So into this mix, there is also a thing called iAccessible too. This was created by IBM, and it's very interesting. So Microsoft have an interface called iAccessible on their platform. And as we'd explained, iAccessible has a number of problems, and it's not as rich and functional as it could be. So IBM essentially embraced it and extended it. They created iAccessible 2, and unfortunately in COM you can't really do interface versioning except by appending a number, so hence iAccessible 2. And yeah, they just inherited from this interface and then added a whole load of new stuff that was good, and people wanted. And so that's fine, so they've got an interface, but of course interfaces by themselves are not extremely useful. They're like, I guess, document file format specifications by themselves. They're not that useful. You can prop the door open with them or not, depending how lengthy they are, so you should get more pages in so you can hold the door open. But you really need software that implements it, right? So you can go read the interfaces here, but more than that, IBM encouraged sort of seeding of this industry, and they took, I guess, what was the OpenOffice Uno APIs, which are very similar to the Java APIs, very similar to the ATK APIs, this whole sort of family there together, and they put them to COM, and then they implemented them in Lotus Symphony, which is, for those that don't know, a fork of OpenOffice based on OpenOffice 1.1 that is slowly going to get resolved in OpenOffice 3, hopefully. 3 something, probably. And they paid the major creator of screen readers in the world on Windows to also implement support for their API. And they paid other people inside IBM, Aaron Leventhal, who's a very clever guy, to implement support for Firefox 3. So suddenly there's actually applications using this, and there's actually screen readers using it as well. And of course it's very nice and incremental. Of course if you don't implement iAccessible 2, that's fine, just fall back to your old code and use iAccessible. And you can query the interface for it, it's either there or it's not, you can extend your application. So there's, but of course there are still some pretty horrible design problems in it, as we saw on the previous page. Probably it doesn't change these nasty proxying problems and all of the evil that lives under the sun. It doesn't make it much cleaner, but of course it fixes many of the problems that UIA is designed to help with, arguably. So yeah, so there's an overview there. So what is our endpoint? But based on this, what we're trying to do is we're trying to move UIA to Linux, and we're trying to clean up, I guess, some of the stack at the same time. And from our perspective, it's interesting accessibility. IPC is fun. Getting a beautiful infrastructure is good. But we have something that works, and we don't want to subvert that. It doesn't make any sense. Let's build on top of it. So the new stack we propose clearly leaves existing screen readers, talking to Python, all of the existing applications. And then initially in the first phase, we're going to be adding this UIA provider API. So this is an API that allows you to add extra accessibility hints to your widgets if you implement them yourself. But better than that, we're going to be implementing it in WinForms. So WinForms is, I've got some pictures later of what you can do with it, but it's sort of a legacy toolkit that's positionally laid out, and it's not particularly wonderful, but it's there, and people write little applications for it. And if you've written it for Windows already, you really like to just move it over to SUSE and run it, and it just works, and it's just accessible. So that's basically the first phase of the project, is to do this piece of the stack. And that will mean that using your existing Orca screen reader, hopefully you'll be able to talk to your WinForms app. Right, excellent. This man is the D-bus in the apps by D-bus here. It's called the raw D-bus. You can have either. If you pay raw. So yeah, there you are. So that's good. And so in the second phase of it, having done, I guess, arguably the most useful piece here, we're then moving on to doing the client piece. So you could, in theory, run your own AT. I've just shut the door. Do come in. There's another door up the back, though. I don't think I'm welcoming enough. Anyway. So you can write a client then using this managed thing and hopefully ship it between Windows and Linux. I think that's probably slightly less useful, but in a completeness view, it's quite nice. And the other thing is that if you look from a social conscience point of view out there in the world, ATs are extremely expensive, like you wouldn't believe. You know, you've heard Microsoft project costs, I don't know, $1,000, but ATs are really, in another league for charging people who are in. It's like sort of pension providers. They like to steal money from retired people who aren't retired yet, So wonderful, you get a huge lump sum when you sign up for a pension. It's like thousands of dollars, and that's all taken from your pot, in a long time. But anyway, not to malign them too badly. They're wonderful people, and they're involved in the AIA. So where was I? Oh yes, but if you could write a nice simple AT that covered, some 70% of the needs across the market, it would be interesting to see what would happen there, running it on Windows and Linux and so on. So maybe that's interesting. It's not something we're interested in, but as a free software project, that would be quite neat for a lot of people. And so then finally there's Moonlight, which is implementing Microsoft's Silverlight-ish stuff. Again on top of Mono, and that needs to be accessible. So we'll be working on that too. So what's the next thing doing? So why bother? All right. So here we have a couple of WinForms apps that are absolutely indispensable. Yet another calendar. What the world needs is another calendaring application. That's why I discovered this when I talked to Sun, and they're investing in Sunbird instead of Evolution on Windows, which is a tragedy. But anyway, and here's another chess game. Yet another chess game, but all of them written using WinForms. And generally, as I say, small vertical apps, right? It's really irritating if you can't use your silly expense filing system on your silly CMS front end, or whatever it is that's been written on Windows and you can't get onto Linux to run, particularly if you're impaired. It's just another level. I mean, we're all used to not having hardware drivers that do proper 3D, right? I mean, that's just normal, But it's not such a huge sacrifice if you can't actually use your computer at all to do, various things. And so hopefully as we fix the, we're missing Flash and we're missing this and missing that and the media codecs, we'll also be fixing that it's also an accessible problem. Which is nice. Here's another Paint.net application. I don't know that that's particularly useful to a strongly impaired person, but anyway. Silverlight is the next thing. So this is again Moonlight running a Microsoft demo app. You get things, flashlight at some level, and there you are. You need to be able to book your flight in your web browser with the ridiculously pretty graphical thing that someone created. So I've nearly finished, which is good. There are no questions so far. We're all sitting there very cowed. So I'm going to heckle. Come on, we need hecklers. Okay, well here's the timeline that I was drawing in the back and didn't quite finish, but the punchline is it falls neatly into two equal parts, like this. So the first year we do something, and the next year we do something else. So first of all, we're starting off with the UIA provider and the WinForms implementation, as I was saying earlier. And we'll be shipping it first on Sled, but we'll be then moving on to package it and ship it for Ubuntu and Red Hat, which is interesting, so it will be everywhere, as it were, and doing QA and bug fixing in the last quarter. And similarly in 2009, there are various stage milestones and demos for the various conferences that happen about here and here. One of the interesting things is that Moonlight is not actually, Silverlight 2.0 as I understand it, is not finished yet, including the accessibility portion of it. So, in fact, we'll be starting to, well, I don't know when it will be delivered. Maybe it's delivered somewhere here, but we're not far behind, right? We're starting to really invest almost ahead of the curve there and getting the client done. Actually, another interesting thing that follows from that rather complicated slide I was showing you back in the day is that our implementation will of course be using native managed code for everything. Let me try and get back to that, so I can ramble about it for a while. So our implementation of this will be broadly, let me try and think which bit is happening. So this is an improc proxy for user 32 and common control things. So when you create a WinForms application in Windows, I'm sure you don't want to know this, but you will in a second. What's that? Oh, first on, opening the door, fair enough. So it turns out that things like the top level window in what you see as a single application is implemented in the kernel, or nominally the kernel, and then some of these controls similarly live in other places, but then other more complicated controls maybe, or whatever, doing trees are implemented in a different process again, and they all live sort of all over the place. And so in terms of implementing rich, new accessibility APIs for this sort of thing, it's kind of a real problem. And particularly because what you can do in the kernel is somewhat limited, and what you can't do, this kind of things. So behind what looks like a rather simple, not very good-looking user interface, there's just this mess of infrastructural compatible legacy stuff that we don't have at all. In fact, our implementation of all of this will be in native C#. And so it's entirely possible, in some corner cases, that by the end of 2008 we'll have a better implementation of common controls and WinForms with regard to accessibility than our competitor, which would be quite nice. I at least would be pleased. So here's the conclusions. Accessibility is coming of age. We have been hiring, if you are very interested in accessibility and you're knowledgeable about it or something. I don't know if you've got any slots left, to be honest. Calvin is running the project. And really, I think with this, there's still a couple of advertising for. Absolutely. So if you have an urge to do all sorts of funky C#, IPC, ATK, toolkit stuff, then do see me. But I think really Linux, accessibility is coming of age, and Linux is going to be really the best platform to do accessibility on. It's going to have beautiful Java integration. It's going to have high performance Office integration. It's going to be, it's just wonderful. All the APIs will be there. Your application will just work. Okay. So in terms of credits, Marcos Skenrax really owns this space inside SUSE. He's been doing all manner of great work for years, particularly on the console, before any of the graphical stuff happened, writing anything called SUSE Linux, which back in the day allowed you to just boot and install, using a braille display and so on for many years. Sun, of course, did huge investment here to bootstrap the accessibility work across the desktop of the Office suite and the web browser as well, I think. Similarly, IBM, with their cunning employ around iAccessibility 2, and just encouraging all this openness to actually happen. And the AIA, I think they have a lot of credit. But of course, the people in Microsoft for actually doing the right thing. Starting to open up, making their specs available, starting to address patent concerns around them, starting to work together with other people and surrender some of the control and things like the AIA. And Calvin is leading this thing here. So you can find out more about it here. There's all sorts of nice links, and you can talk to people, and there's pretty pictures of Calvin driving through mud in his four-wheel drive vehicle. So go and see it online. I think that concludes my talk. Are there any questions? So hat with that hat.
How would the A11Y project influence the likes of, say, Adobe with regards to Flash supporting VRL 2 for video over webcam streaming over Flash? Because currently it only supports V4L, which most modern webcam drivers don't support well in Flash.
Yeah, that is an interesting question, not one to which I know the answer. Since I know relatively little about Flash and relatively little about that, I don't know, it's really sort of a more moonlight question now, I guess. But I'll just make up an answer anyway, just to help you. So I think competition is good in this space, right? It's clear that, having iAccessible 2 and seeing it in the marketplace galvanized people into action and started them opening up and creating alternatives. And similarly, Moonlight, I think, is, well, Silverlight is clearly behind in the rich web client space, but it looks like it's going to be the first free software, fat client, rich web app infrastructure out there. Now that is amazing. If I told you, 2 years ago that Microsoft would be funding the first open source, fat client, web app, you would have just laughed. It's just, it seems ridiculous, right? Still might seem ridiculous to you. But anyway, it is actually happening. So, so the thing is that things change, and companies do funny things, you look at a list of companies here and you can think of instantly some really good things they've done and some really stupid things they've done, And that I think it's worth judging what they do by how they do it and not, not judging them simply by a brand, big is bad and, if it begins with N it's bad and if it begins with S it's perfect and, this kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's a complicated space. And we'll see. I think the whole world is going, ultimately, I think the whole world is going open source. And, we're going to see a, you can laugh, but I think it's true. And I think we're going to see a huge amount of struggle and heartache and pain as big companies try and change their culture and learn to understand what it means to work with other people and to really open your product up and to do that. And, it's going to be a hell of a ride for the next few years as big companies get involved. And I would love to see this turning into a free software company. At least more so, let's say. Yes, sir.
A lot of applications nowadays are just normal web apps, as in not any kind of Silverlight, Moonlight, Flash, jizz on the screen. How you mentioned the Firefox 3 accessibility. Is that a kind of, as in the application has accessibility? So say you go to the preferences dialog and is that made accessible, or is it the pages? How does that fit in with like a bigger picture outside rich files?
That's a really good question. So yeah, is it the content inside, or is it thrown around the outside, or both? And the answer is both, clearly. Yeah, so it's no good having the documents accessible if you can't change location. So yeah, no, it's both. There are a number of interesting complications with JavaScript applications and the creation of very beautiful looking, responsive, asynchronous Java and XML stuff inside a document and making that accessible in a meaningful way. And this whole thing called Web Aria, which is trying to standardize this, or there's a group in the W3C working on that, and lots of interesting work going on, much of which I don't know anything about. So, if you search for Web Aria, you'll find out a whole lot of functionality. But it's coming. It's coming pretty soon. How am I doing for time?
Questions?
Excellent. Okay, any more questions? No rotten tomatoes for me? Come on, someone's got a haircut. No? Okay, well, thank you very much. You've been very patient. Very good.